March 1966. In an interview with a Japanese journalist, American prisoner of war Jeremiah Denton blinked a message in Morse code, confirming for the first time that Americans in North Vietnamese prisons were being systematically tortured. July 1967. A search and rescue unit known by the code name Bright Light attempted to ambush Viet Cong guerrillas as they marched a group of prisoners along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to their secret jungle sanctuary. January 1991. In the desert outside Baghdad, Western POWs were used as human shields to deter the bombing of an Iraqi military installation. For centuries, POWs have been used by warring nations to enhance their chances of victory. The combatants of World War I witnessed the end of chivalry. By the start of World War II, the use of air power and heavy firepower had turned the act of surrender into a much more common occurrence. In 1950, when fighting broke out in the Korean Peninsula, the Western powers and communist nations were engaged in a struggle for world domination. The Chinese involved in the hostilities used the United Nations POWs as propaganda tools to gain support for their ideological views. During the Vietnam War, the prison camp was to become the front line, an extended form of the battlefield.
I believed that the best thing for me was to choose an attitude of defiance and an attitude that they would be unable to break my spirit and my will.
From the beginning, it was clear that the United States was facing a guerrilla war that it was not prepared for, in terrain with which it was totally unfamiliar. Military officials grappled with a serious problem, attempting to identify, locate, and rescue their prisoners of war. The difficult terrain and dense foliage presented a major obstacle, but the political ramifications of sending more and more troops into Vietnam complicated the issue even more. During the mid-1960s, the Johnson administration found itself confronted by increasingly vocal critics of its Vietnam policy. As the anti-war movement grew, the administration continued to play down the fact that additional troops were being sent into Vietnam. The Johnson administration's reluctance to formally acknowledge a state of war set up a situation that jeopardized the soldiers who were taken captive.
As the war escalated and more air crew were going right into anti-aircraft fire, and we were losing lots and lots of airplanes and a lot of crews, the population started to rise, and it looked very much like this was going to be a little longer than anybody thought it was going to be. The Vietnamese changed their policy in Hanoi. And instead of prisoners of war, okay, became an air pirate and a criminal.
With no formal declaration of war in Southeast Asia, the North Vietnamese proclaimed they were not bound by the rules of the Geneva Convention. They treated their American POWs as criminals rather than prisoners.
There was no information because the North Vietnamese said, since it was an undeclared war, that they were not bound by the Geneva Convention. Therefore, they did not have to release names or allow prisoners to write or accept packages or any of the things that you would normally consider as the right way to do things under conditions of war.
Back at home, a conflict arose over how to deal with the POW issue. Members of the U.S. State Department advocated using diplomatic measures to obtain the release of the POWs, while the military believed a more aggressive approach was necessary. In 1965, the Johnson administration received confirmation that 3 POWs had been executed. The Department of Defense was given the authority to establish the Joint Personnel Recovery Center, a highly classified intelligence and commando unit that specialized in lightning-quick strikes. Bright Light was the unclassified code name given to intelligence developed on the whereabouts of prisoners in prison camps.
Bright Light was a code term used over the radio when we knew that we had specific information about American POWs and their location.
By 1966, the rescue of prisoners became a major objective. Using guerrilla-style tactics, the Joint Prisoner Recovery Center in Saigon repeatedly attempted to recover American prisoners in enemy hands. The Viet Cong organized dangerous long marches, taking their prisoners from the point of capture to their jungle sanctuaries. South Vietnam turned out to be a war zone full of mines and booby traps that took the lives of many Viet Cong as well as the POWs they marched through the jungle trails. The Viet Cong soon found they could move more quickly if they transported their prisoners in bamboo cages. U.S. Navy SEAL units kept up surveillance in hopes of spotting one of these processions.
They had to get involved in getting the prisoners logistically from point A to point B. And in doing so, they tried to keep the prisoners hid in the jungle. SEALs got involved because SEALs, as a small unit, were able to quickly react to timely information, and it didn't take us long to get where we needed to go.
The Viet Cong understood how valuable their prisoners were. They feared discovery and tried to avoid American attacks. They were aware that the Americans searched for their POWs on the ground and by air. They also knew that if they were sighted in possession of a prisoner, a rescue operation would be launched. Sometimes search and rescue units gathered intelligence by interrogating enemy personnel. This often involved a snatch operation.
A snatch operation is where you would go out and snatch somebody, not off the street per se, but off the trail or from a denied area which was controlled by the enemy. You bring them back with the main purpose of gathering intelligence from this individual.
When you captured someone, the unwritten rule of the game was, now that I have you, you're mine.
Information regarding the whereabouts of captured soldiers was only relevant if it was fresh, which meant it could be no more than a few hours old. Taking into consideration the location of the enemy and the nature of the terrain they would be traveling through, U.S. Navy SEALs could quickly organize a snatch operation. They were able to call up other assets such as rescue helicopters, gunships, or medical personnel in the event of injury. More often than not, they would return with their captured prisoner.
I would generally tie their elbows together behind their back, put them up on point with myself, so let them be the first man in the team as we move. And I found them to be most generally cooperative with what I wanted them to do. As far as moving down the trail, not making any noise, not making a pest of themselves, or not being a nuisance, because that's a sure way to get yourself killed.
Secrecy was of paramount importance. If a member of the SEAL unit was captured, the entire operation had to be scrapped. Members of the search and rescue teams naturally assumed that if one of their men fell into enemy hands, he would be subjected to torture.
Well, everybody's going to break under enough torture interrogation. If you're captured, I mean, you hold out as long as you can, but everybody knows that you're not going to be able to hold out. You're going to end up telling them everything you want to know. And everybody understands that. That's why everything has changed right away.
The Viet Cong were very skillful at staying on the move. The SEALs often tried to track the Viet Cong. They were operating in enemy-controlled territory, and they knew the possibility of death was high, both for themselves and the Americans they were trying to rescue.
The adrenaline level was always very high. So you have to be able, in the Vietnam environment, you have to be able to sneak in, sneak up to the house, and then quick jump in there to save the person before anybody can shoot them.
Over the course of 7 years, the odds proved to be overwhelming.
Hunting for POWs in Vietnam was just about like looking for a needle in a haystack. Even when you thought you had good information, the information was almost always a few hours old. And if you say to yourself, the Viet Cong won't rest more than a few hours before they get up and move again, you can see how difficult it would be to try to get ahead of them.
In spite of their highly classified efforts to identify, locate, and rescue American POWs, not one Bright Light rescue operation ended in success. Not a single prisoner of war was rescued from enemy hands this way. Ultimately, search and rescue blamed their failures on their inability to develop accurate and timely intelligence on the precise location of POW camps, especially in the jungles of South Vietnam. In the north, the great majority of prisoners were captured pilots. The North Vietnamese Army referred to these POWs as air pirates and treated them as criminals. In prison camps like the Hanoi Hilton, the pilots' survival skills would be tested to the limit. In response to the horrors of world wars, men of state attempted to set basic standards for the humane treatment of prisoners of war. At the Geneva Conventions in 1929 and again in 1949, diplomats signed into law treaties stating that POWs must receive adequate food and medical care and be given the opportunity to correspond with their families. One of the issues that the signatories wrestled with was the definition of missing. Missing meant that a man lost in a combat zone might have been taken prisoner or might have been killed in action. In every war, the fate of soldiers classified as missing in action has haunted the conscience of those back home. Advances in the technology of weaponry have only exacerbated the problem.
These are terrible weapons we're talking about. These are very large explosions, aircraft that can burn up, and the person die and there's no trace of them. So this whole business about missing in action and not knowing whether your husband is dead or alive, there's nothing new about that.
According to the Geneva Convention, it is the duty of every signatory country to report the names of POWs it has captured. The procedure is simple. Captors fill out capture cards and send those cards to the government of the captive's country through the International Red Cross. Although they were signatories, the North Vietnamese ignored this mandate.
The North Vietnamese never filled out any capture cards, never gave it to anybody. So the Americans had no idea who was in captivity, who was dead or alive. No clue.
Since there were no capture cards, the families back at home were left to suffer. One woman who found herself in this situation was Carol North, the wife of Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth North, an Air Force pilot who flew F-105s.
He went the end of May, and the tour was determined at that time by how many missions were flown, and the magic number was 100. And he felt he'd have 100 missions by Thanksgiving.
The date was August 1st, 1966. The day dawned hot and humid over the Mekong Delta.
We were in an area that had been relatively fire-free. When we crossed the Red River, the Golden BB came out and hit my airplane in 3 places. It started to burn pretty badly, but I managed to turn it to the north, trying to get out of the Delta and get into the hills, so I thought I'd have a better chance of evading and getting picked up. But the controls got mushy, and when I was looking up at the treetops, I knew it was time to eject, so I ejected and chute popped and I hit the ground.
After North's F-105 was reported missing, search aircraft were sent to look for his missing plane. Since he'd managed to eject successfully, an electronic beeper was activated that sent a signal to other orbiting aircraft. But the North Vietnamese had also seen Ken North eject, and militiamen captured him.
They really wanted us to get us alive. I mean, we were a bargaining chip alive. We were worth nothing dead to the Vietnamese. I was taken to a very primitive village, and I was treated very well that first day. And the next day, the regular army came, and things changed.
The ordeal of being taken captive is said to be one of the most difficult experiences any soldier can endure. It represents that moment in time when a man realizes that he is no longer the master of his own destiny.
You fear what's going to happen to you. Anybody that doesn't have fear, even when they go into combat, is either lying or don't know where they are. They don't know what they're doing. My overriding concern was my family. I had 4 young daughters and my wife, and I think that overwhelmed me.
The Viet Cong were well aware that pilots shot down over enemy territory could provide valuable military intelligence. They interrogated North to find out what targets he was to hit the following day.
So as soon as you didn't answer a question, then they started torturing you. And their favorite one was what we call the ropes. They tie your arms behind your back at the elbows and pull up as hard and tight as they could until they usually dislocated your shoulders, actually. It doesn't mean that you gave in, but because I don't know of anybody that died from the ropes on initial capture, but that was how they got you started, trying to get your attention.
During the second week of August 1966, a military chaplain informed Carol North that neither her husband nor his remains had been recovered.
I felt that he was alive. In the first place, he's a very stubborn man. He's a strong man. And he was a very strong young man. And I just felt that if anybody could survive, knowing that he was alive when he hit the ground, that he would be alive.
Like many another airman shot down over Vietnam, Ken North was put on a truck and taken to the infamous Wallow Prison, a jail once used by French colonialists to detain, interrogate, and reportedly torture the Vietnamese. The Americans had nicknamed it the Hanoi Hilton. 4 years passed. Carol North lived in a zone of silence, not knowing whether her husband was dead or alive. In the late 1960s, as Carol North waited to hear if her husband was dead or alive, the Vietnam War continued to escalate, and more Americans were taken prisoner. The captives quickly discovered that the North Vietnamese paid no attention to international law. Unknown to U.S. government officials, Americans incarcerated in North Vietnamese prisons were routinely subjected to torture. Hundreds of years of French colonialism had schooled the Vietnamese well in the practices of systematic torture. American POWs became the unfortunate victims of their education in cruelty. The stinging backlash of French domination was felt in the Hanoi Hilton and the other 10 prison camps spread throughout Hanoi, where more than 1,500 prisoners were housed. Here, guards routinely punished those who broke camp rules by hanging them by their arms or dragging men with broken legs over the ground. They attempted to force other intractable prisoners to become pawns in their propaganda machine. When Lieutenant Commander John McCain was shot down by a surface-to-air missile over Hanoi, his injuries were so serious that at first the North Vietnamese wrote him off for dead. Once his identity became known, he was considered more valuable alive.
I think it was pretty clear that they were not going to give me medical treatment until they found out that my father was an admiral. And then they did by giving me transfusions and taking me to the hospital, literally saved my life. I can only assume from my treatment that they were not going to treat people who were seriously injured. They were not going to treat me until they found out that my father was an admiral.
McCain was taken to the Hanoi Hilton, the prison where another downed pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Ken North, was being held. Their captors were especially interested in using the POW issue to foment and drive anti-war sentiment in the U.S. In order to do so, they tried to present a favorable image of their prison camps to the rest of the world. One that demonstrated that prisoners were receiving fair and humane treatment in accordance with the protections of the Geneva Convention. They viewed McCain as a valuable asset in this campaign.
It was very clear to me that the Vietnamese wanted me to stay alive. I'm afraid some of my other friends didn't have that kind of insurance. Second of all, that meant I came in for a lot of special attention and that they were going to get something one way or the other.
The North Vietnamese offered McCain early release in exchange for his cooperation, but McCain had already realized that the key to his survival was hard-headed resistance.
I saw what happened to prisoners who they did break their spirits, and that then drove me to perhaps act in what some viewed as a reckless manner, when actually they're right. It was reckless, but it also was the best attitude that I could choose to come out as best I could with my honor and dignity intact.
With almost religious fervor, the guards sought to either break or convert their prisoners through a process of political re-education known as proselytizing. Sometimes they coerced prisoners into greeting a delegation of anti-war protesters from the United States, or into signing war crimes confessions. Torture was routine for POWs who did not cooperate. Lieutenant Commander Mike McGrath kept a journal of drawings that recorded his 6-year ordeal in the Hanoi Hilton.
to resist their interrogation was easy enough because I just didn't believe it. And I'd tell them so. I'd say, no, you're wrong. And then tell them, and of course they'd slap you around and knock you off the chair and do a few things like that to you. But if it was just to try to interrogate you to get information, that stopped very early on because they knew we didn't have anything.
The secret abuse of POWs went undetected until 1966, when a television interview with Jeremiah Denton indicated to American officials that he had been subjected to some form of systematic torture.
They blinked out in code, torture. And for what it was worth, it didn't make any difference. I mean, they were going to torture us anyway, but we didn't. We knew the propaganda that they were putting out, the treatment was fine, and it was anything but fine.
Those who were subjected to torture relied on the 1954 Code of Conduct established after the Korean War. The code attempted to regulate how POWs behaved during captivity by setting forth a set of basic ideals towards which POWs should aspire. But in many instances, the code turned out to be more curse than blessing.
We had some cases in prison where POWs held out so long that they were literally broken, as we call it, and then found it very difficult to snap back, because once you were broken, then you were reduced to such an abject state that you were Pavlovian.
Many POWs struggled to withstand unspeakable acts of torture. Some blamed themselves for succumbing to their captors' inquisition.
And of course, when the time came when they really decided to put the hammer down, that it became very difficult, and I reached a point where I was signed and dictated a war crimes confession, for which I, of course, regretted, and to this day regret enormously.
The Vietnamese knew that if they could isolate a man, make him feel abandoned, they could more easily destroy his resistance and break him down. In reaction, prisoners devised ingenious ways to keep up communication with their fellow captives.
Senior people were all kept in solitary, but together. They put the word out, and we had a way of communicating with everybody in camp through all kinds of ways, even parking notes under a rock and tap codes, and even yelling if we had to.
The prisoners learned to lean on one another and soon discovered that the power of the community was greater than that of the individual. Even in solitary confinement, the POWs felt they were not alone. It was during their guards' afternoon naps that they did most of their communicating, sticking notes under the toilet bowl, tapping on the walls, or using coughs, hand signals, and clothes snappings to make contact.
I got so that I could not only tap it almost as fast as I can talk, but I could recognize someone else's tap by the methods that they use while they're tapping.
POWs adopted the Smitty-Harris tap code, named after the POW who devised it. The letters in the alphabet were simply divided by order into 5 groups of 5 letters. The letter K was dropped.
They knew we had a method of communicating. They didn't know it was a tapping code. You could also talk through a concrete wall to the people in the other cell block by using the tin cup.
Because their wives and families had no clue as to who was alive and who was dead, the POWs worked together to compile a mental list of every man in captivity.
Every day you went through the drill of memorizing and reciting yourself the names of all of the POWs that you knew were alive. And that list grew up to 550 people.
The hope was that someday someone would be able to get out and recite the names of those left behind. March of 1970, Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth North was selected by his captors to receive a special privilege. It was perhaps the thing he wanted most, short of release, the opportunity to make contact with his family, who had endured nearly 4 years of not knowing whether he was dead or alive. The acceptance of such an offer, however, was prohibited by the United States Code of Conduct.
Most of the articles of the code I agree with. Don't accept special favors from the enemy is one, which was the reason I didn't write letters, because I considered that a special favor until they did it for everyone.
Despite the burning desire to correspond with his wife, Colonel North refused, hoping for a time in the future when all prisoners would be granted the same letter-writing privileges. In the meantime, Carol North had returned to Wellfleet, Massachusetts, so that she and her 4 daughters could be close to her family. One morning, she received an unexpected telephone call.
You're talking small town America. This town has 1,200 people in the wintertime. I got a phone call from the postmaster in this little town of Wellfleet. On the phone, he said, "I think you have a letter from your husband." And I went in and I said, "Hi, and I've come for my letter." And the postmaster, Mr. Barrio, was a big man. He handed me the letter, and the tears were running down his cheeks, just pouring down his cheeks. And I looked, and it was on the overseas, the very light onion skin, airmail paper that you used to send overseas letters on, was this little letter. It was 13 lines long, and it was addressed to me, and I opened it, and the salutation was to me and the 4 girls. And it said, "I'm fine, I'm alive, I wish you Merry Christmas." It came about Christmas time. And I just fell apart.
Shortly after she received the letter, Carol North was contacted by an intelligence agent who wanted to study it.
There was a system that I don't feel free to go into, but there was a system that the men were communicating through these letters. So I would send the letters to a specific place, and they would go through them and glean out what information they could. And I never knew what it was. I never knew what the code was, and it used to drive me crazy.
The letters were organized along the lines of a daisy chain. A daisy chain was a secret form of communication in which a message was hidden within the letter. Since prisoners were only allowed to write letters that were 5 lines long, it often took several letters to complete a sequence. Some POWs were not allowed to compose their own letters. That job fell to someone else assigned to bury the secret code into the correspondence. The plan worked well, unless the Vietnamese decided to hold back any of the letters. Carol North soon accustomed herself to the fact that even the letters she sent back to her husband had to be rewritten. It is known that intelligence agents back home employed small information capsules and even a device called the microdot to secretly communicate with the prisoners. The microdot was a tiny photograph of a document, so small that it could only be read with the aid of a high-powered magnifying glass, yet so clear that an entire column of newspaper copy could be compressed into an area the size of a pencil point. The magnifying device was smuggled into the prison camp, and for a time the POWs were able to satisfy their intense yearning to know what was going on in the outside world.
When they found the microdot reader, that was the end of it. I've only had one that I know of. One guy had it in a jar of peanut butter, squished down in it, and then as he was eating his peanut butter, he came across this lumpy thing. It was wrapped in cellophane, and he knew what it was.
by 1970, the North Vietnamese were finally beginning to make some concessions. Over a period of 5 months, they allowed more letters to be sent home than in all the previous years of the war. Many people credited this change in policy to the work of Carol North and other members of the National League of Families who'd done so much to publicize the plight of the POWs. The strain of Carol North's ordeal had been eased by the support she and the other POW wives were receiving from the Nixon administration. Each time she received a letter from her husband, she always tried to read between the lines.
It was hard to tell about the emotional condition from the handwriting, but I will say for the most part, with the exception of a couple of letters, the handwriting was basically quite normal. There was a period of time when he was quite ill, and you could see it in the writing. The writing was very light and very not defined, terribly well defined. And I got that one letter and I thought, things aren't too good.
POWs in Vietnam have reported that one of the main reasons they were able to resist the enemy was the strength they drew from the group. Even when one individual was singled out for abuse, the feeling of camaraderie helped him prevail. In 1967, a young Navy navigator named Mike Christian was shot down over Hanoi. During his stay in the Hanoi Hilton, he collected pieces of cloth from care packages. With the aid of a needle he fabricated from a piece of bamboo, he sewed a crude American flag onto the inside of his blue prisoner's shirt.
In the evening in our cell, before we would have our evening meal of soup and bread, we would face the shirt which we'd hung up on the wall and say the Pledge of Allegiance. It was a very important part of our day there to pledge allegiance to our flag and our country.
After several months, prison guards came in to search Mike Christian's cell and found his shirt with the flag sewn inside. They removed it. That evening, the guards returned and ordered Christian to step outside. From inside their cells, the other prisoners could hear his cries as he was severely beaten.
And after a couple hours, they threw him back inside the cell, and he was pretty well dinged up by him. And the cell in which we lived had a concrete slab in the center of the cell and a light bulb in each corner of the room that shone 24 hours a day. Cleaned up Mike as well as we could, and I went to lie down and go to sleep on the concrete slab, and I looked over in the corner of the cell and I saw Mike sitting there beneath the light bulb with a piece of white cloth and a piece of red cloth and another shirt and his bamboo needle making another American flag. He wasn't making it because it made him feel better. He was making it because he knew how important it was for us to pledge our allegiance to our flag and our country.
In 1973, the belligerents met in Paris to sign a truce to end the war. They agreed that the final release of prisoners would be carried out no later than the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. In February of that year, Project Homecoming began airlifting the POWs back to the United States. For many ex-POWs, their stay had become one of the longest periods of military captivity in American history.
We were kind of a very tight-knit group of people who, although obviously we were ecstatic at being out of that situation, there was a certain sense of regret when we finally split up to go home to our families, because we knew we would never ever recapture that same kind of bonding and spirit of common cause that really helped all of us as a group collectively do better, far better than we could have individually.
The aftermath of captivity is a seldom told story full of both joy and heartache.
I left 4 little kids who were just ankle biters. And came back with at least 2 or 3 of them by that age were independent thinkers and didn't, and I think I tried to pick up where we had left off, and that was a mistake.
When Ken came home, the hardest thing for me was learning to step back because I had been the boss for 7 years.
In spite of the hardship that the experience inflicted on the loved ones at home, some say that the years of captivity were not lost time.
I grew up a lot. I grew a lot. You get stronger, for sure. It's either get stronger or sink. In many cases, your world grows. You go from just you to a lot of people.
By continuing to oppose their captors, POWs brought the battlefield behind their prison walls.
In prison, the major sustenance is the example, the friendship, the courage, and the love of your fellow prisoners. I was not a hero. I was witness to 1,000 acts of courage and compassion and love by men who remain my heroes to this day.
20 years later, when American troops were deployed to the Persian Gulf, the memory of the Vietnam POW experience was still alive. Soldiers entering Desert Storm were armed with lessons learned in the prisons of Hanoi. On the 4th night of Operation Desert Storm in January of 1991, fighter pilot Colonel David Eberly was on a mission to destroy a chemical weapons storage facility inside Iraq. Eberly's sortie took him and Tom Griffith, his systems officer, deep into the northwest sector of Iraq. As they approached their target area, they realized that a surface-to-air missile had locked onto them. A blinding flash hit the plane and the 2 men ejected. Moments later, Eberly was on the ground.
I'm not even conscious that I'm breathing. I have no idea where I am. I'm just kneeling upright, focused on a fireball on the horizon, and I think I'm dreaming. I must be dreaming.
Eberly and Griffith managed to evade capture as they crossed the desert, hoping to reach Syria. They were finally seized when they sought shelter in what appeared to be a deserted shack. As a POW, David Eberly had no way of knowing that the Persian Gulf War was to be the most televised conflict in history. Shortly after his capture, Eberly was taken to a command bunker in downtown Baghdad for an Iraqi propaganda videotaping session.
They were trying to coerce us into making statements against the war and in support of the Iraqi government.
But Eberly had a different purpose in mind when he made his televised appearance.
As I was led through the door, I could hear the sound of a camera running like an old 8mm or 16mm camera. That sound, I was glad to hear that.
Remembering how the prisoners of North Vietnam had disappeared for a long, silent stretch of time and not knowing what his own future might hold, Eberly made sure to clearly identify himself.
David William Eberly. اسمي العقيد David William Eberly.
Eventually, those pictures would get to the hands of the Allies, and they would know I was alive. My family would know I was alive.
The Iraqis hoped to use the confessions of Allied POWs to engender support for their side. However, the Iraqi television program did not have the desired effect.
It wasn't just Iraqi television, because CNN picked it up and the pictures were rebroadcast around the world, causing outrage amongst the American people. The soldiers had clearly been beaten up. They were clearly very unhappy about what they were being asked to do. And as a propaganda campaign or a propaganda device, it backfires.
Images of prisoners of war looking as though they'd been subjected to abuse turned their captivity into a matter of immediate public concern. David Eberly was among the POWs released at the end of the war. 20 years earlier, he had attended a survival training school established after the Korean War. In that conflict, communist and Western powers struggled for world domination, and POWs became the pawns in an extensive propaganda campaign waged by the North Koreans and the Chinese. The fate of POWs during this conflict had taught the U.S. military that servicemen needed to be prepared to handle psychological manipulation. Today, instructors at the U.S. Air Force Survival Training School draw heavily from the lessons learned during the Korean War, when Air Force pilots were subjected to brainwashing techniques and coerced into making false war crimes confessions.
Political indoctrination was another part of the process that Americans were faced with. And again, it was a new circumstance, and it was recognized that we needed to combat that kind of exploitation.
During the Vietnam War, the vast majority of Air Force and Navy air crews had the benefit of having undergone survival school training.
They were better prepared to deal with the problems of captivity and conduct after capture. They had the code of conduct, and they were able to use that as their moral and ethical guide to make the effort to do what was expected of an American military man.
However, many POWs in Vietnam found it difficult to perfectly follow the code during intense torture. In 1975, the code was reinterpreted to reflect the realities of holding up under torture.
Code of conduct in its wording has stayed the same. The teaching of it, interpretation of it has slightly changed in that there's been emphasis on the phrase "to the best of my ability." And so the way we teach it now is to hold out as long as you can, give them something, fight some more, hold out as long as you can, give them something, fight some more. In some ways that is more successful than holding out until the absolute end when you are reduced to the animal state.
Today, part of the survival school training focuses on the interpretation of the code.
The mission is to prepare individuals, in this case in the Air Force, for the rigors of captivity, take away some of that fear of the unknown, give them the principles and the moral guidelines in what is called the Code of Conduct for the U.S. fighting man, which applies to all services.
At Survival Training School, the U.S. Air Force crews are taught how to survive in any kind of environment.
The primary purpose behind the United States Air Force Survival School mission is teaching warriors to stay alive, period. And that can take many dimensions.
Every soldier in survival school is made to understand that we live in an age when the technology of warfare has transformed the act of being captured from personal disgrace into something more like an accident. With the increased range and speed of movement on the battlefield, it's become much less dishonorable to be captured.
There's a definite difference between capture and surrender. Capture is when an individual is totally surrounded, unable to evade away from the situation, and unable to inflict damage upon the enemy without senseless loss of life.
Throughout history, the experience of captivity has forced prisoners to become resourceful in ways that are unimaginable. Against all odds, individuals have challenged their captors. Either through escape, resistance, or group solidarity, prisoners of war have done much more than merely survive. They've often been able to transmit vital pieces of secret information back to their own forces. Time and time again, they've provided shining examples of bravery and courage for others to follow.